Hello, Azza. My name is Sara Hillman, and I'm going to be reviewing your video research today about French and commercial signs in the UAE. Let me start out by just giving you a little bit of background by myself. I'm not a French speaker, and I'm not based in the UAE. However, I am a long-term resident of Qatar. I've been living in Qatar for 11 years, and I have visited the UAE. And I have also conducted linguistic landscape research, more on education scapes and public events such as the FIFA World Cup. So I'm approaching your project from this broader sort of linguistic landscape and sociolinguistic perspective, and as somebody who's been a long-term resident in the Gulf. So overall, I found your video very interesting and engaging, and I think the topic is really important, especially given the multilingual and highly transnational nature of the Gulf, especially in the UAE. Um, and I appreciated that you're trying to connect French commercial signs in the UAE to questions of identity and interculturalism, and I think these examples are potentially rich, especially looking at restaurant and beauty salon signs, because I do think these are sectors where language does a lot of symbolic work. So I do have some suggestions though. In my comments, I'm mainly going to focus on areas where I think the framing and organization could be improved a little bit, along with some suggestions for deepening the analysis, and then thinking a little bit about the presentation itself. And I have a few suggestions for strengthening the visual storytelling. So I'm going to go ahead and play the introduction to your video.
La rencontre entre la francophonie et le monde arabe est particulièrement féconde. Nous réfléchirons dans cette vidéo sur la manière dont cette rencontre s'exprime concrètement aux Émirats arabes unis. Rien qu'en se promenant dans une grande ville comme Abu Dhabi ou Dubaï, on peut voir à quel point l'environnement graphique est un véritable carrefour de culture. La présence de la langue française dans les panneaux commerciaux aux Émirats n'est pas juste un phénomène d'affichage. Derrière ces enseignes et ces mots venus d'ailleurs, il y a tout un système d'échange, de représentation et d'identité qui mérite d'être décortiqué.
Okay, so I'm going to stop there. So you have this kind of short overview of your presentation, and then you jump right to an overview of the data collection. And what I would suggest is I think there's some more things that maybe should be added right in the first minute or two of your video. So I think, one thing is just the lack of UAE background. So you do talk about it a little bit later on. You talk a little bit about Arabic and English and French. But I think you could provide a lot more context right in the beginning. And especially, there's nowhere in your video where you really talk about, so who are the French speakers or kind of the French language publics in the UAE? Because these aren't just, French tourists, for example. These are, long-term residents of the UAE who might be from Lebanon and North African countries, and maybe some from Europe and France, but also African countries. So those who are, speaking French, it's a diverse population, and I think it would be good somewhere in your video, but I would recommend, right towards the beginning when you're introducing this topic to give us a little bit of background, right, about French speakers in the UAE in a little bit more detail. And I would also encourage you to maybe say a little bit more about your own positionality, like who you are in your relationship to the UAE context, because I wasn't sure if you were somebody that is based in the UAE or if you are somebody that is outside the UAE. And, I mean, you mentioned that you're curious about why these signs are in French, but it's not clear to me exactly like why you, right? And what is it about your your background and interests that relate to French signs in the UAE. So tell us a little bit more about, French speakers in the UAE. Who are they? Tell us a little bit about you and how you have, come to be interested in this topic. And I think the other thing that I would do, because you mentioned linguistic landscape in that first, 40 seconds really. And I would go ahead and just define it the first time you use it so that the audience understands that the video is not just about French words on signs, right? But it's really about how um, visible language is organized, public space, identity, right? Commerce, belonging. Um, so I would suggest that because you do that later, but I would, in my opinion, it's always good to define things the first time you use them. And that's, a good space for that is in that introductory part of your video before you get to the data collection. Um, and I would suggest that you actually move the data collection later after you've sort of set up the background to your study and your research question and everything. Put that first, and then you can tell us specifically how you went about your data collection. But since you have your data collection section here, I'm going to go ahead and play it, and I have a few comments about your methodology.
Pour préparer cette vidéo sur l'analyse de la présence de la langue française dans les panneaux commerciaux aux Émirats, j'ai constitué mon corpus d'exemples issus de captures d'écran, de recherches sur Google Maps, de photos sur les réseaux sociaux, et je me suis concentrée sur la restauration et les salons de coiffure. Je me suis souvent demandé.
Okay. So I would like to have a little bit more clarification about your methodology. So you mentioned that the corpus comes from social media, photos and screenshots and online searches. But I guess it's not exactly clear to me why were you not able, why were you not able to take the photographs yourself? And if you have, valid reasons for why you were able to take the photographs yourself, I think the limitation of only relying on online sources needs to be acknowledged. I'll talk about that more in a second. But I think also I'd like to know like how many, how big was this corpus? How many signs in French, did you find? So it might be good to just start out with some basic um, uh, numbers or percentages in terms of, how many signs you actually collected when you did your when you started to build this corpus. And I think so. I mean, one of the limitations to me in terms of only collecting the signs online is that you're missing kind of the wider context around these restaurants and beauty salons. Um, so in terms of like who are the intended customers or who are the customers that go to these places, and how do the signs interact with other semiotic elements that are present in the space? Because it's never just the sign alone, right? There are usually other things that may um, evoke, for example, luxury or refinement. So these things work in tandem together. So I just found myself wanting to have a better, like a stronger sense of sort of the lived environment around these establishments and kind of where they're located and who they might cater to. So I don't know if it is possible for you to collect your in-person data and actually take, the photographs yourself. But if it is possible, I think that would make, your study and your video richer. And you could also get higher quality photos because I've noticed that some of the photos don't seem, they're a little bit not clear or the DPI doesn't seem very big. So that might be something to think about and whether you'd be able to do that to strengthen the visual richness of the project. And another thing I was just thinking about is that if you have taken these photos from social media or from, Google Maps screenshots, I just wondered, it might be worth considering, or clarifying any like copyright or attribution or fair use considerations related to the images. You may want to, you know, uh, tell us clearly either at the end of the video or maybe, in small uh, font somewhere on the next to the image itself, where you got the image from. I just think that's important, especially since this video is intended for public academic circulation. All right, I'm going to play a bit more.
En voyant une devanture de restaurant aux Émirats ou une vitrine de salon de beauté où s'affichent fièrement des mots en français, par exemple la Casbah d'Alger, restaurant et café ou boudoir beauty lounge, pourquoi ce choix? Est-ce que cela vise juste à faire beau, à paraître chic ou à donner une dimension internationale à l'enseigne? Ou y a-t-il quelque chose de plus profond, de plus révélateur sur l'évolution des sociétés dans cette région du monde? En effet, la problématique qui émerge de ce questionnement peut se formuler ainsi. Jusqu'à quel point l'usage de la langue française dans les enseignes commerciales aux Émirats arabes unis favorise-t-il le dialogue entre culture et identité? Et dans quelle mesure ce paysage linguistique contribue-t-il à la constitution d'un espace plurilingue et interculturel?
All right, so in this part, you go over a little bit what it is that you're interested in exploring. I'm not sure that I would call it a research problem because you're not necessarily looking for a solution, but maybe it's a guiding research question or an area of investigation. But again, I think it would be nice to have a better understanding of sort of how you came to this research question. And it could be based somewhat on your own personal experience, but it could also be based on other maybe studies that you have read. So I think before you sort of maybe jump to your research question, you may want to again provide us with a little bit more context of how you got there, right? And well, let me go ahead and play a little bit more.
Ce qui est frappant, en tout cas, c'est cette cohabitation des langues. L'arabe, bien sûr, est partout, comme langue officielle. L'anglais, quant à lui, est la langue de la mondialisation et du commerce, qui a sa propre place dans le pays. Et puis, il y a le français, un peu comme une touche de raffinement, de prestige et d'ouverture.
So again, yeah, I think I would move this earlier in terms of giving us a little bit of context about languages in the UAE. And of course, it's not just English, Arabic, and French, right? Mention, the broader multilingual landscape. And one thing I would encourage you to think about, and I'll mention this again as we go through some of the examples that you give, is that you seem to often be interpreting French language as related to refinement, prestige, elegance, cosmopolitanism. And certainly, I think there is some of that, right? And there are studies, that have been written about that. And I think particularly, yeah, there's this commercial aspect of it. But I also think that analysis might be a little bit too narrow, because I think some of your examples also point to maybe nostalgia or heritage or belonging, for these different French speakers that have made their home in the UAE, or just even kind of regional memory. And so we'll come back to that as we look at some of the examples.
Il faut dire que le français joue dans l'imaginaire collectif un rôle particulier. Pour beaucoup, il évoque le luxe, la culture, la gastronomie, mais aussi l'histoire et l'élégance. Alors, voir le français s'afficher dans un paysage urbain qui n'est pas francophone à l'origine, c'est non seulement une surprise, mais aussi un puissant.
Yeah, but I guess I wonder, is it surprising? Or maybe it's not so surprising when you have, a lot of groups of people that speak French as a first or second language, right? Not just French Europeans, but also lots of North Africans, and Africans and Lebanese and other groups. So I'm not sure that I'm not sure necessarily that it's that surprising, but again, maybe explaining a little bit about who you are in relation to this project may help us understand, why it was surprising to you.
Vecteur d'identité. Notre vidéo se déroulera en deux temps. Nous présenterons d'abord le cadre théorique qui éclaire notre démarche. Ensuite, nous développerons une analyse du corpus.
Yeah, so here in this next section, you go into the theoretical part and you define linguistic landscape. And I think, again, it would be better to move this before you actually talk about the methodology and your corpus. Like I would define linguistic landscape right in the beginning when you first mention it. But then what I would also encourage you to do is to um, situate your study within the kind of the broader linguistic landscape research in the UAE. And I can leave some suggestions in the comments, but you could look at scholars like Sara Hopkins, Melanie van de Hoven, Magdalena Karalek, Changlong Gu, among others. Because to my knowledge, none of these scholars have focused specifically on French language in the UAE, or I mean French signage in the UAE. I think Gu's work, for example, focuses more on Chinese and English and Arabic. So I think positioning your study in relation to this existing scholarship would help strengthen the scholarly framing and contextualize your unique contribution more clearly. And that maybe could even then kind of go into how you've developed your specific research question and your focus on French language.
Afin de mettre en lumière les tendances identifiées dans les deux secteurs de la restauration et de la mystique. Mais ici, aux
So I'm
Émirats, il
going
y a une dimension toute
to forward through this a little bit.
particulière et voir dans le rêve. Dans la même logique, nous pouvons citer l'exemple de la Belgique où
Yeah, so here's the part where you're going more into linguistic landscape, which again, I think you can move earlier.
Le paysage linguistique, linguistique en
Sorry, I'm just trying to skip through it a little bit
de
faster.
distinguer le français et le flamand dans les panneaux publicitaires, visibles dans les
Yes.
panneaux routiers.
So again, yeah, here's where you provide the definition, which I think you can do earlier on when you first mention it.
Les enseignes commerciales, déverse. Le choix de la langue sur une enseigne n'est pas seulement une question de législation, c'est un geste d'intégration et de reconnaissance.
Yeah, okay, so you're talking about, and here's before you go into your specific examples, that including French represents a gesture of inclusion and acknowledgement of the other. But I think one thing that's not clear is who are we including and who are we acknowledging? Because again, you haven't really given us much context in terms of the UAE and the different groups. And I think particularly for people who might be watching this who are not familiar with the UAE context, it's really important that you provide some of that, context.
De l'autre. Ce constat, on peut l'appliquer au commerce. Un restaurant qui choisit un nom en français, c'est souvent pour toucher le public international, mais aussi pour se positionner comme étant un espace sophistiqué, ouvert et cosmopolite.
So again, this idea of elegance, of cosmopolitanism, but is it only that? So let's look at some of your examples.
À ce titre, je pense au restaurant nommé Byblos-sur-Mer, un restaurant qui évoque l'Orient tout en projetant ses clients dans une expérience pluriculturelle. Les mets, l'ambiance, la langue, tout concourt à créer un sentiment de dépaysement heureux. L'emploi du français dans ce panneau permet de même d'attirer une clientèle internationale.
So you're talking about this restaurant, Byblos-sur-Mer, and that it's, meant to attract a global clientele while preserving a local cultural anchor. Again, I think you need to explain a little bit more what you actually mean by this. And I know that Byblos, right, is an area in Lebanon, and there's actually a very famous iconic hotel, right, called Byblos sur Mer, which I'm sure you know about. So and it's been there since like 1967. So I just wonder, in some ways, if this restaurant is really more about evoking Lebanon, right? And as you know, for the Lebanese expatriates that live in the UAE, and maybe it's there, yes, to cater to everyone, but also to maybe provide kind of a sense of belonging to the Lebanese community. And maybe there's some nostalgia, right, around this, or that sort of diaspora belonging, right? So I think you could go maybe just a little bit deeper in thinking about your analysis here.
Culturel local. Le panneau remplit ainsi une fonction symbolique, il transporte le client.
And just one other thing, and I'll mention this in a couple of the other signs. I would encourage you to also look at some of the semiotics and think about if they're meaningful in some way. I can't really see, there's some sort of figures on top of where it says Biblos, and it's too blurry for me to really make it out, but I just wondered if they're meaningful in some way and what, those figures might say, right, to the audience that is, how might these be perceived or understood?
Vers un monde historique et culturel toujours vivant dans l'imaginaire collectif. Le recours à l'arabe, non enseigne à travers la translittération, facilite quant à lui la mémorisation du nom par le client, mais l'absence d'un texte explicatif précisant la nature du commerce reste notable. À travers
But I think again, like, be more specific in explaining what is it, what is this explanatory text that's not there? Like a lot of what you're saying may not be clear to the audience who is watching this video, so I think you need to be a little bit more specific in terms of what you are referring to.
le renvoi à la ville de Byblos, nous pouvons lire un hommage à la cuisine orientale et une référence au souk ottoman. Se situant au diapason des établissements de restauration, les salons de coiffure renvoient plutôt à un imaginaire universel, voire spécifiquement lié à la culture française. On relève quelques constantes dans le champ lexical des noms de ces établissements. Certains renvoient à l'idée de la culture française, tandis que d'autres évoquent directement la beauté féminine. Le choix
Yeah, so in that case, yes, I mean it may relate particularly
de la langue française,
let me just go
tandis que
back
d'autres évoquent directement la beauté
to this idea of feminine beauty and to
française, tandis que d'autres évoquent directement
sorry,
la
let me just go
renvoi
back.
à l'idée de la culture française.
Yeah, so what I was going to say was this may be really there, right, to sort of evoke that Frenchness, right, and that sense of beauty and refinement. But in the next
Évoque
example,
directement la beauté féminine. Le choix de la langue française pour exprimer un concept tel que la beauté féminine contribue
yeah, so related to this idea of feminine beauty, I would also encourage you to look at not only, again, this sign that uses a French word, actually mixed with English, right? But to look at some of the semiotics surrounding the sign. So we see these mannequins, right, of these women, which the mannequins seem to function as sort of signifiers of maybe Eurocentric, or French beauty standards, right? And so I think, again, I would encourage you to look at some of these other aspects besides just the French language, and take your analysis a little bit further semiotically. And so how does that also contribute to this idea of feminine beauty, or what kind of feminine beauty?
associer le français à l'idée du beau. Dans le secteur de la beauté et du style, le français sert parfois à vendre du rêve. Un nom comme la loge Luxury Beauty Salon for Ladies and Gents, ou version française, évoque le soin, le chic à la française et la qualité. Ces choix lexicaux parlent à une clientèle qui cherche l'authenticité, le raffinement, le sentiment d'être dans un cancan ou une bulle d'élégance et de calme.
And just, yeah, as I'm looking at these photos, again, I'm just wondering, it would be nice to have kind of the larger context. For example, where are these located? Are they on, streets and neighborhoods? Are they in large fancy hotels? Because I think this context too makes a difference in terms of maybe how they're interpreted or perceived.
Par ailleurs, les enseignes commerciales aux Émirats ont également une dimension mémorielle.
Yeah, in this example too, I was thinking about how I think you could also extend your analysis a bit to look at things like typography and script choice. So, for example, I think that's with the Josette, right? It's in this typography that's kind of very, kind of elegant and yeah, something about it evokes Frenchness to me, right? And so I think it's not just always the language itself, but also sometimes the way that it's designed and the way that it's written.
Les enseignes des restaurants ou cafés prennent souvent des noms qui évoquent des régions, des villes et des histoires personnelles. Dans le cas du restaurant prénommé la Casbah d'Alger, le substantif Casbah nous renvoie en effet à toute une culture, à un patrimoine vivant qu'on transmet par.
Um, yeah, I mean, again, here I feel like you're being a bit vague, and maybe you want to give a more specific context right here in terms of what this place is in Algeria, right? And maybe again, maybe this evokes a bit of nostalgia for Algerians that are living in the UAE. And I mean, yes, it points towards Maghrebi heritage, right, and architecture and memory, but it's not necessarily just, historical memory. I think lots of these are sort of layered, right, in terms of kind of the Francophone Arab histories, as well as places where, local residents, they find, food that they enjoy or a place that they feel like relates to home, that makes them feel like they're part of that their culture, right, is welcomed in the UAE.
Inconsciemment à travers un simple panneau. Sur le plan symbolique, le panneau La Casbah d'Alger, restaurant et café évoque par son intitulé le Maghreb et convoque
So again, when you say that,
intitulé
a
le
symbolic
Maghreb,
allusion to the Maghreb, explain a little bit more what you mean for your audience. Because again, I don't think everyone will necessarily know exactly how this connects to the Maghreb. And so I would just be a little bit more explicit in your explanation.
et convoque un imaginaire riche. Enfin, sur le plan social et culturel, à l'image de la Casbah qui constitue une enceinte capable de réduire les différences tout en encourageant la diversité et en préservant la singularité de chaque entité, cette enseigne renferme une myriade d'images évocatrices et singulières. Elle évoque l'architecture arabo-musulmane, les musiques et mouachah andalou, la gastronomie et les traditions vestimentaires arabesques en nous faisant voyager à travers le temps et l'espace. Parfois, il suffit d'un mot pour créer l'étincelle culturelle. Pourquoi choisir boudoir, beauty lounge plutôt qu'un nom anglophone? C'est une question de cible, bien sûr, mais aussi de symbolique. Le boudoir, c'est l'espace privé, l'intimité et le raffinement.
I'm going to move forward a little bit. So here you talk about boudoir a little bit, which I think is a nice analysis.
Boudoir, et là où l'on peut éloge la culture France 18e, ce plan symbolique émancipé à travers, tout comme les salons de beauté contemporains de culture personnelle dans un cadre. Retenir de tout ceci que l'usage du français dans.
Okay, so here you are coming to your conclusion. Let's watch a little bit of the conclusion.
L'affichage commercial des Émirats arabes unis va bien au-delà du décorum. C'est un phénomène social, historique et identitaire. Il contribue à créer un espace plurilingue et interculturel. C'est une forme d'art urbain, un langage visuel et surtout une invitation permanente à dialoguer et à se mélanger.
An invitation to dialogue. So to dialogue about what? Tell us a little bit more about what you mean.
Pour conclure, je vous invite à porter un autre regard sur les enseignants français aux Émirats en vous baladant en ville. Cherchez ces mots en français venus d'ailleurs, voyez comme ils s'écrivent dans le paysage, comment ils participent à l'atmosphère et au charme des endroits que vous fréquentez.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to stop there for a minute. So again, I think overall, just in terms of these different signs that you focus on, a couple restaurants and a couple beauty salons, I think the French is often interpreted, right, as refinement, prestige, elegance. And I think that probably I think you can make that argument with the beauty salons. Although again, I think it depends a little bit on the clientele for the beauty salons and where they're located and the neighborhoods. But I think for the restaurants, I think maybe that conclusion is maybe just a little bit narrow. So again, I would encourage you to think about how French signs uh, or French signs in the UAE, how they may function as nostalgia for different groups of people, different groups of French speakers living in the UAE, or, relate to their heritage, right? Or relate to wanting a sense of belonging or some kind of regional memory. So I think you could go just a little bit deeper in thinking about that. So let me just finish this up.
Ce dialogue des langues, ce tissage invisible, c'est aussi ce qui fait la richesse et la beauté de nos espaces publics et communs.
All right. So let me just kind of summarize some of the main suggestions I have. So one, I would encourage you to reorganize this a little bit. I think it might be nice to just start out with a specific sign, just as a, kind of a hook and a way to grab the audience, right? So starting out with a nice illustration of a French sign. And maybe you want to, first tell us a little bit about who you are and your connection to the UAE. Or, I mean, you can structure it how you want, but also tell us a little bit about the language context in the UAE and who are the French speakers in the UAE. Um, Give us a little bit of background. I mean, yes, define linguistic landscape the first time you use it. Maybe give us a little bit of background in terms of literature about linguistic landscape in the UAE. And then I would go into your research question and the specific study you did and tell us about this, the corpus that you are collecting. Again, in terms of the methodology, I think there are some limitations. And so if it's possible for you to go and take pictures yourself, I think, and collect just some field notes in terms of sort of the neighborhoods that these restaurants and beauty establishments are in, and how other kind of semiotic things work alongside the French names. I think that would, make your data much richer. Um, and then, yeah, just in terms of your actual analysis of the examples that you've chosen, again, I think you could go further semiotically and look not just at language, but look at typography, script choice, think about, a little bit more deeply about maybe the English and French mixing or transliteration, other images that are around it. But, be specific when you're explaining things, because I feel like sometimes you're a little bit vague and your audience may not fully grasp what it is that you mean. Um, yeah, I think those were my main comments in terms of the content. And then my last suggestion, just in terms of the presentation itself, is that one thing I noticed is that there's a lot of white space, um, and some of the visuals are not very high quality. Um,
Bas qui constitue une enceinte
and then, just some of the visuals don't always sort of,
Maghreb,
oh,
parfois inconscient.
let's
Des
see if I can.
restaurants ou cafés prennent
Yeah,
souvent
just
des
some of the visuals don't align and there's lots of white space. So I think, if, and it might be because they get blurry when they're too big, but it would be nice if you have higher quality images to blow them up on your presentation bigger so we can see them more. Because unfortunately, just a lot of them are blurry, and I think that's, of course, because they're coming from social media and like Google images.
clientèle qui cherchent l'authenticité. Français, à
Yeah,
l'hommage, les salons
like
de coiffure
I mean, here's just a good example where there's just all this white space. So it would be nice to just see a very big, clear image of the sign, and with a label, and maybe also if it's not your image, maybe you want to, put a caption to let us know where that image came from. So I think rethinking, like trying to use this white space, um, or reducing the white space and trying to improve the quality of your images, I think would make the presentation look nicer, and it would, enhance your visual storytelling of your research. Um, Trying to think if there was anything else. Think I think those are all of my comments. Um, Thank you very much for putting this together. I will definitely, I do a unit on linguistic landscape in the Gulf, in this course that I teach about language communication and identity in the Gulf. And I will definitely share this video with them, whether you revise it or not. But I really do encourage you to enhance it and revise it because I think it's already good, but I think working a little bit on deepening the analysis and improving the image quality and other things, I think would really enhance it and make it a really, really excellent research video. And I think it would, get widely used in classes and other things. So I hope this is helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I will exchange my email with you. And thank you very much for sharing your work.